honest questions addressed to powerful texts. And so we want to bring that spirit very much to the fore here in this discussion, which bears directly on the current social situation. With the Black Lives Matter protests that began last year, we've seen another recrudescence of the cry for justice from the African American community, which periodically erupts, and we want to understand why it is that nothing seems to change fundamentally. And I think reading Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the greatest leaders of Black empowerment, is essential if we're going to try to, as a country, deal earnestly and intelligently with the crisis that always seems to be upon us. You have access to that introductory video, which goes over a lot of the history of the heroic age of the civil rights movement, which basically runs from 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which would have been the first blow, legally at least, the major blow against Jim Crow, the system of American apartheid, of segregation, which was mostly operative in the South. Though it was part of the point that Malcolm X was making, and that Martin Luther King would take up more and more after Malcolm X's assassination, that this wasn't a problem confined to the South. And in fact, with the protests, we see this is certainly a thing you see in the urban archipelago, as it were, of America, wherever the Great Migration took large numbers of African Americans. You have these conditions of intense poverty and intense policing, which make for a very combustible situation. We go from 1954, which was a legal decision which had no practical effect, and it took many confrontations, including the ones I went over. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, where Martin Luther King Jr. first rose to national prominence in 55, 56. And then the heroic age ends with the assassination of King in April of 1968. The history is a very moving history, this time period of heroes. These two that we're treating tonight, the greatest, but there are many, many heroes. And I think part of the issue that Malcolm X certainly would have emphasized is that where are the heroes like this in our own time? And that's a serious question. And I think all of us have to confront that for ourselves. One thing to note is that it took very uncomfortable images so in Birmingham, the great mass protests that were organized there in '63, where you had Bull Connor, this inhumane police chief, turning on the high pressure water hoses on children and so on, and the attack dogs, that garnered national attention and a national sympathy, and helped propel the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the most important legislative action for the establishment of civil rights for African Americans since Reconstruction. And of course, that's the historical matrix here, that because of, I believe, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, we had a Reconstruction that did not realize the promise made by the Union victory in the Civil War, which was to realize the humanity and the civic equality of Blacks. And then you had, paralleling that, the protests in Selma and the Bloody Sunday, which I think was in '64, which helped in turn propel the passage of the Voting Rights Act in '65. Now, that's also another contemporary issue. We're seeing a lot of discussion now about whether certain Republican-backed initiatives now are in fact meant to secure integrity in the voting process, or are they meant, in fact, to have the same result as in the past, a differential effect on Black communities to enforce a disenfranchisement. And I think we can't work on slogans, we have to take a look at the facts, but there is a history here that we have to also take very seriously. There's a lot of issues that are put on the table by these very interesting men that their mutual interplay was, they only met once. They met during the filibustering of the Civil Rights Act in Congress. But Malcolm X's no compromise stridency, his always brandishing the threat of Black self-defense was a thing that set his position apart from Martin Luther King's. But they had the same goal. It was a question of how quickly and what would be tolerated on the way to that goal. And we all have to ask ourselves, right? If there's an oppressed community, what is justified? The catchphrase Malcolm always used was "by any means necessary." That was the phrase of that organization he founded at the end of his life, after he broke from the Nation of Islam, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. By any means necessary. Now, that's not a very pleasing slogan to our ears if we believe in the necessity of having good means to good ends. But is it right to just always bring technical judgments to bear when in fact we should hear the great cry of the heart that really is behind Malcolm X's fervor? He did come from a disadvantaged, an economically disadvantaged background, whereas Martin Luther King was from a more privileged background, and that did play out. I think it's part of why King took a while to come to see what Malcolm X was saying in terms of the systematic nature of racism. That is, its implication in the economic order. And that was something that after Malcolm X was assassinated, that King would more and more talk about, and especially after the Watts riots in '65, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, King was so disturbed and had to think about why it is that his battleground had always been the South in particular. I mean, he'd done things in other places too, but why, after the legal victories that had officially dismantled Jim Crow, why was it that the Watts riot could happen? And he was looking more and more at these economic conditions and the immense brutality of the housing situation and so on. And of course, always the police brutality, which is a constant. And towards the end of his life, he was organizing the Poor People's March on Washington, which was going to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic, not anti-capitalist, but he saw more and more. The break with President Lyndon Johnson had been over Vietnam and the massive amount of money that was being spent to prosecute that war and being diverted from the Great Society programs, which Lyndon Johnson had pursued because he had become a convert to the civil rights cause and had seen that there was an economic basis to the problems. But the Vietnam War meant there was not enough money to fund the Great Society. So when King came out against the Vietnam War, he was doing so not merely as a pacifist, he was doing so as a man who saw the connection between the underfunding of these programs and the plight of his people, but of all the poor. And that's why he was engaged in this Poor People's campaign at the end of his life for another march on Washington when he was assassinated, as he was helping a sanitation workers strike in Memphis. So there's a lot of issues here, and we see that even today, a lot of the ways to try to make the Black Lives Matter protests less convicting for us. We'll hear a lot about talk of socialism and so on. Honestly, it's very interesting to see how that charge is always there whenever the Black community tries to argue for systematic redress. There's always the charge of socialism, and I think we all have to we have to consider why that is. Is that actually a just charge, or is it because there is something unjust about the distribution of property? There's other issues, but I think that's, for instance, I'll just put it on the table. The whole question that Malcolm X brings before us about identity politics and Black nationalism, if we were to hear a lot of his positions and not know that it was because of, on behalf of a certain community, and this is one of the questions that I allude to as far as gun rights. I mean, is it not American to say that we should act in self-defense? And would, in fact, those who support Second Amendment rights, in fact, Second Amendment rights according to the original meaning, which had to do with militias and self-defense and the right to revolt, is Malcolm X not, in fact, making a very originalist kind of argument there? But then, if you hear that it's from Malcolm X, then you say, well, that's beyond the pale. Why is that? If we hear, well, a people has to be able to defend its integrity as a people, does that sound like people who want to put up walls at our borders and say we owe our own people something first, and so on? I mean, it's interesting because Malcolm X has an ability, I think, to scramble our political sentiments, and I think that's a very good thing. Not just Malcolm X had a big influence through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and SNCC and Martin Luther King worked together more closely after Malcolm's death, and that's the matrix out of which Black Power, Stokely Carmichael's coining of Black Power, and even including the Black Panther Party. So we have two divergent streams from the time period. Even though Martin Luther King came closer and closer to Malcolm X's position in a way, I mean, always insisting on nonviolence, though, but recognizing more and more the systematic nature of the issues involved. There was still a question about whether the civil rights establishment, and this was Malcolm's concern, the civil rights establishment, how easy is it for it to be captured by the current political class? And I think that's a serious question.
Okay, question 1. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King link the struggle for racial justice in America with anti-colonial movements throughout the global South. Why is the vindication of African-American demands for racial justice necessary for the American proposition to be taken seriously in the world? What's the difference between civil rights and human rights? Question 2. Would advocates for the constitutional right to bear arms recognize the justice of Malcolm X's conjuring the specter of the bullet, that is, invoking the right to revolt, if Black communities find no redress of grievances in law? Would advocates of gun control find Malcolm X's position repugnant? Is nationalism good? Is Black nationalism good? Question 3. How many of Martin Luther King's arguments against the white moderate land against those who have opposed recent protests against police brutality? Is there a colorless white viewpoint, a view from nowhere, objective, undetermined by social positioning, from which to assess social dynamics and racial dynamics in particular? Question 4. Malcolm X advocates the occlusion of particularist religious claims in favor of the demand for justice. Martin Luther King insists on acknowledging the matrix of the civil rights movement and its nonviolent direct action in the Black Christian church, but he sees the church in general as betraying its original revolutionary force. Has relegation of social justice concerns below orthodox dogma corrupted Christianity? How can we determine whether a law is just or unjust?